So everybody loves robots, of course, perhaps other than the Boston Dynamics robot that came out yesterday. That's a quadruped that opens a door with an arm that comes out of its head. Nope is a good word for it. That's not the kind of robots you're working with.
Nope.
You are working with robots for kids, specifically for getting kids interested in STEM. And I think it might be a good start to talk about maybe the genesis of the company, why you got into this, why this is so important to you as an industry.
Yeah. So the story starts about 5.5 years ago, almost 6 years ago, when I left Google. And I left Google because I wanted to spend more time with my newborn daughter. And as I spent time with her, I started to think a lot more about kids, especially kids growing up in the 21st century. And we were calling the world a post-PC world, where and their iPads and these very powerful tablets or devices in the hands of our kids. And the difference between these devices and the PCs that we used when we were kids was that these devices are a lot more closed. And the PCs tended to be a lot more open, and programming is a very common thing you did on personal computers. And that's what I felt needed to change. And that became the impetus for founding Wonder Workshop. And we specifically found research that showed that kids can grasp concepts of computer science at a young age, but they need something tangible, something physical to make it effective. And yet, no one had built the right tool for kids to learn computer science at the age of 6 to 10. And that was the gap we sought to fill with Wonder Workshop. So we built our first robots. They're called Dash and Dot. And over the last 5 years since we started the company, they've now grown to, we've shipped more than 500,000 robots to customers around the world. And they're used in more than 20% of elementary schools in the US currently. So we're pretty proud of what we've been able to do. But as I said, these robots, at the end of the day, the goal was to first make it really accessible for kids, so they are fun right out of the box, and at the same time make it accessible to a very large audience. So one of the first goals for us was making it accessible both to boys and girls. And we're very proud to say that every day we see data which shows that both girls and boys are equally interested and engaged on our platform. We host a robotics competition every year where we now had 25,000 participants from 63 different countries this year, and 50% of them were girls. And last year's winning team happened to be a team of all girls from a rural town in Michigan. So both bridging that gender gap as well as diversity and economic status, something we care passionately about. So what the price point is, who it's accessible for, is something we've tried to build into the story as well.
Yes, I wanted to talk about some design considerations that you went through. Kids individually are notoriously finicky about their toys, but getting into a market of both boys and girls, how are you designing these robots, and maybe how are you taking feedback from kids as to how they want their robots to look and behave?
Yeah. So right from the design process, we've weaved in feedback from parents, from teachers, from kids. So for an example of the design constraints, our robots, when we were first testing with kids, we found that girls would invariably say, well, that's more like my brother's toy. It's not really for me. And we couldn't figure out why. And one day we hit the wheels, and we suddenly found that the girls were much more interested in playing. Our learning from that was that anything we build, kids imagine what they've already seen in the world in that. So the preconceived notion they bring to play. And if you break that preconceived notion, we can actually bridge the gender gap much more effectively. So our robots don't look like anything on this planet. They have a single eye instead of two eyes. They're sort of three-legged, not four-legged or two-legged. You can't see the wheels, so you don't know exactly when you first see it, how it moves. And all of that allows children to bring their imagination to play. That breaking the preconceived notion helps bridge that gap, was one. And the second was, when we're doing the studies, we asked parents why they don't use some of the existing robotics kits that were in the market. And we found price was one big deterrent. And second was, parents would tell us this more than children, where they would open the box and 1,000 pieces came out. And parents said, they feel scared. They felt, and their words were, they would look stupid in front of their kids trying to help them. And so more than the kid, parents would put them back in the box, in a closet, and never get opened again. So one of the other learnings was that the robots can have a long path to learning, but they need to be accessible the moment you open the box. So they need to be They need to be playful, they need to be fun. So that aspect of building an emotional connection right out of the box, the moment you turn it on, has been a very integral part of the robot design. So personality and character is very integral to the design process as well.
So I want to return to something you mentioned earlier, kind of a parallel to the PC revolution of the 80s, where families were getting these computers in their homes and were able to start tinkering with code and things like that. This revolution is fundamentally different in that it's hardware, but robots are seemingly escaping from the lab more and more, very sophisticated machines with great sensors. I was wondering if you could talk about the opportunity here and kind of the parallels to what we've already seen in the PC revolution and how that might play out with hardware now that it's cheaper and more powerful, specifically for kids to be able to get into.
I think one interesting observation we also had when designing our robots, and we have this epiphany where if the robots are fully assembled and built and they're more accessible the moment you open the box, is a very similar parallel in the 70s when the PCs were first. Typically, personal computers were done in computer clubs and these where people build their own computers. And the moment of very wide accessibility came when you could buy a PC fully built, assembled, and you essentially used it for your day-to-day use. And that's something similar we're seeing with the platforms like we're building and others, where robots come with design for what you can do rather than having to build your own robot, for one. And second, as you mentioned, the cost is given the fact that we can leverage the compute power of devices that sit in our hands. We're able to bring the price down for these robots significantly. And also packing the robots in with sensors and data and connecting them with a world of devices around us allows us to use them in more interesting ways than we've seen possible before. And that's what also makes it interesting. So one of the other areas that we're looking at as an example is the fact that you can 3D print accessories or add-ons to these robots to create extensions also opens up a world which wasn't possible before. Then there are platforms like Arduinos and microbits and others which have a very low cost and yet open up a world of extensions through electronics and brings that data and open the world of sensors. And so all of that put together makes it not only from a price perspective, but also from accessibility in terms of approaching with the computational complexity is a lot lower barrier. So we're seeing a world of people getting into it that weren't doing this before. And how we see this, all of these becomes tools for invention. We see kids using our robots at the age of 7, using this platform to invent new ways to solve problems around them that they didn't have a platform like this before. And it's designed in a way that's age appropriate for them. So they have programming tools that they can use. They have devices and robots they can use. And that's being transformative in classrooms and at homes.
So I was curious if you could give us some insight as to how the kids are interacting with these robots. It's a super fascinating field to me, human-robot interaction, how we're building kind of these new bonds with essentially a new kind of being that we've invented and has become increasingly powerful. What are you seeing kids interacting with these robots like?
In schools, there's often a lot more context that kids are using these robots in. Robots come with sensors. They can detect objects around them. They can hear sounds and respond to directions of sound. They can be extended with manipulation tools using Lego and other forms of construction. So all of that becomes ways for them to imagine how they would solve problem in the context that either the teacher sets for them. So the kind of problems, the kind of things that we see kids doing often are around imagining a real-world problem, but in the context where they set the context in the classroom. So, for example, if they have to clean up an environment, if the robot has to save an animal from a forest fire, describing that problem in the context of a classroom setting, and then using the robots and the programming tools to solve that problem, as an example. And at home, where we see a lot more open-ended creativity come to light, where this is something where we provide challenges in the apps for the kids, but sometimes what we see kids doing is largely using it more in terms of play and interaction with other people around them, whether programming the robot to follow them around or follow their dog and interacting with things like those, or using it with accessories like we have a ball launcher which launches balls around, building games into that and interacting with other kids around them, and keeping in mind that these are robots designed for kids under the age of 10, so 6 to 10-year-olds. So in that context, how they can extend their play, their playroom, their homes in ways that they imagine is how we see them doing.
And why is this so important for STEM? And I'm thinking maybe the difference in having something that's physical in the world for these kids to be playing with versus coding on a computer or learning digitally. Why is it so important to have something that's couched in a physical context?
There's a lot of research, starting back at MIT with Seymour Papert doing extensive research on how physical, tangible interactions, like with robots, and back then was the logo turtle. It has a very different impact in children seeing the abstract concepts of computer science come to life in front of them. So a simple example being, if you draw a square on a screen versus having a robot move around in a square, the difference between what kids walk away with is very different. The second thing is when kids are programming on a screen, they're often need keyboards or other devices which sometimes they don't have the motor skills to manipulate as easily as a 6-year-old. So creating those interfaces to be more tangible also becomes important. And the one thing that makes the robots far more interesting than the screens is that the programming on a screen tends to be a single person experience. You do that by yourself. The robots are inherently social. The moment you put a robot out on a floor and you start to program it, immediately you get 3 more people coming in and looking at what you're doing, and you actually can use help with other friends to do something together. And that makes a big difference because at the young age, we want these kids to grow up in an environment with interacting with other people. So the skills they pick up are not just about computational thinking or computer science, it's also social interactions and team play with other kids, which is just as important in the modern day world.
Yeah, and I think there's great promise with robots like these, but also maybe a danger for opening up even more of a digital divide in America. I was curious if you had thoughts as to how your company might help get these robots in the hands of all kids, and how as a society we might be able to embrace robotics, this burgeoning field, as something that might be able to help for STEM across the United States.
Yeah. For us, it's a priority for us as a mission to get in the hands of not just the privileged. And the ways we do that is to work with schools all over the country. So we have special programs. We work with Title I schools. How do we help them get funding? How do we help them get robots or devices at a lower price? How do we partner with them in different forms so that those kids have access to the same tools that other communities do? And that's something that we continue to work on across the board. And the robots, first of all, start out at a fairly low price point. Our robot Dash costs $150, and compared to what typical robots cost with the kind of sensors it packs in, it's 1/5 or 1/6 the price of a typical other platform. So that's the first step, and then helping teachers bring these robots to these classrooms and use them effectively with their students is something else we invest a lot in.
Yeah, so you mentioned sensors. I wanted to actually talk about that, the things that have made this sort of product possible for kids these days, and I guess this reflects in all the robots that are kind of escaping the lab and out in the real world. A part of it is computational power, and part of it is, of course, better sensors. Can you talk about why now? Why at this point in technological history are we getting these pretty advanced machines, I mean, for kids to be playing with, to learn STEM?
So first thing that we saw why it was possible now versus others is, so our robots use a very low amount of computational capability in the robot itself. So we have a Bluetooth chip, and really we just use that chip for all computation that happens on the robot. And how we do that is by offloading bulk of the computation to a device like an iPhone or an iPad. And the fact that we live in a world where those devices are everywhere, and not just the Apple devices, but Android devices at fairly low price points, where these are in every household. Those tablets are in pretty much every schools. And when we started the company in 2012, we saw this trajectory where with Bluetooth, more and more devices were shipping with Bluetooth, and specifically BLE. And that allowed us to build a product that pretty much everyone could see using in their house. And that's how we could bring the price point low enough, is that we don't have to build a lot of computation in the robot itself or a lot of memory in the robots. Everything's offloaded onto the computer. So the robots really becomes a bunch of sensors and actuators that are cobbled together in an industrial design and personality that kids can interact with and engage with. So that was one. And the second was sensors themselves. Given that a lot of these devices, iPhones and so on, ship with so many sensors packed in, that's brought down the cost of many of these sensors considerably low. So we can actually build a lot of these sensors into the robots, whether the gyro, the accelerator, accelerometer, and so on, which are now extremely low priced for us to build into the robot and package that for consumers.
Yeah, so I wanted to return to the human interaction with robots a bit as well. I think some people are looking at a danger possibly of bonds forming between robots and in particular kids and the elderly who might not understand that this is a one-way relationship. The robot may seem to be affectionate, but in reality it's just code. Do we need to be specifically careful going forward as far as kids and robots are concerned as to the kinds of relationships that are forming here that may not be reciprocal?
I think, yes, we do believe that we should be approaching any of these interactions with a sense of care and responsibility. So one aspect is building bonds with these robots. The other is around data privacy and security that we bring to bear, given that we're interacting with kids. So we take special care on all of those aspects. So one of the things for us was, however engaging and endearing the robot may be, at the end of the day, the robot does what you program it to do. And if we always have that context that we put forth in front of a child, then however much of an emotional bond they build, they also always realize the robot is a machine that I am programming. I am the one in charge. And that's actually an important aspect of what we try to bring to bear with every device we build. The person who's in control is the kid, is the child. And they have agency over the world around them. And the robot, at the end of the day, is what is executing what they're programming it to do. And I think that if you have that context, we've seen that while children do build a lot of strong emotional connection with the robot, but it still lessens the impact and they still feel that they are the ones in charge. Another example that we look at is as kids interact with voice interactions, what does that lead to? So we've looked at how we could possibly build voice interfaces with our robots, and if we're building a product specifically directed to kids, what kind of an experience does it lead to? Would we want the language to be done in a way where we would expect them to say please and thank you as a part of the interaction or not? And so those are things that we pay careful attention to, because we do believe that we have a sense of responsibility to bring any product to market that's being designed for kids.
And how are you planning to stay competitive in an increasingly competitive market, given how much robotics is exploding right now, in particular for consumers, for kind of the first time ever having these advanced machines in the home? How are you going to be competitive going forward?
So for us, the key to staying competitive is to keep innovating. As long as we know we are innovating ahead of our competition, learning from our customers and solving the customer's need, and staying mindful of where the world is headed, is something that we need to do. But outside of that, one of the things we see is from the very first day of our business, we've been very focused on our customer. And so for example, we built Dash and Dot. We've only focused on elementary schools or that age kids. And education has been a big part of who we are and what we do. So for us, in the consumer space, I think there's a lot of noise that often happens. There is definitely a lot of competition. But we've seen that in education, given how we've designed the robots and the approach we've taken, so we build robots all the way from hardware up. We build the software applications, so there are work that's gone in that cannot easily be replicated. And there's a suite of curriculum and content and teacher training material that happens on top of that. And now we have this very highly engaged community of teachers around the world and students who are programming on a platform every day. And that helps us stay competitive compared to any new company that comes in. Because in the end, that community is, I would say, a big competitive advantage we have over anyone else.
So hoping you could look forward maybe 5 years as to how robots are going to be interacting with kids and vice versa in the sort of STEM education. This is a revolution that has already kicked off. It's in full steam. In 5 years, where do you see robots playing a place in the classroom?
I believe we're still a very, very early stage of where that world is. As I mentioned, we are in about 20% of the classrooms, in elementary school classrooms in the US, and we are pretty much the most widely used platform. So we have a lot of room to grow, and the market has a lot of room to grow. I believe that I think there will be more such innovations coming to market in the classrooms, leveraging a lot of existing technologies being rolled out. So whether it's AI technologies, AI platforms, voice interactions, more around vision. And for us, and how I envision the robotics space to evolve is, rather than robots being used to teach math or English or science as much as them becoming a stream of learning and education by itself. There's so much more that kids can learn from about these robots and what they're capable of and how they can be used for everyday problem solving, that we haven't even scratched the surface on what can be made accessible. An example, I was telling someone, 60, 70 years ago, there were 2 people in the world who understand the relativity, and now it's taught in high school. And so similarly, robotics and computer science is permeating these schools, and there's a lot that kids can actually do at a young age, and we haven't even started doing that.
I'd also ask what you think it is with kids and robots, why kids love robots so much. In my reporting, I've come across this a lot, save for one study where they looked at kids assaulting a robot in a mall. They were kicking it a lot. But kids have this seemingly inherent fascination with these kind of new beings that we have invented as a human race. Why do you think kids just love these things so darn much?
Yeah, and I would suspect, again, that the kids love robots that are not very human looking. And I think anything we've seen where very humanoid robots tend to be a bit more scary. And so, and I think, and I'll go back to the learning we had, which is true, I think, is that if kids don't know what this thing is that you put in front of them, if you break a preconceived notion they have, then for them, they are by nature curious. And that, I think, just leads to a notion of they want to figure out what it is. They approach it with a sense of curiosity. They want to understand what it does, how they should interact with it. And some kids may kick the robot, but for most part, kids actually treat it more like a friend they're trying to figure out in this world. And they're young, so that they haven't been, what's the right word, but the curiosity is still alive in them. That innocence is still alive in them. And that's very different than how adults approach these tools. And I think that's a very big difference, which is why I think but it works much better with non-humanoid robots than with humanoid robots, I think.
The other interesting thing about this robotic revolution is the diversity of forms that we're seeing. You see bipeds, quadrupeds, the aforementioned quadruped that can now open a door with its head. I was curious, looking forward, maybe in the context of your company, what kind of forms you might want to explore, maybe beyond the wheeled machines. Looking forward, what would you like to see as far as robots are concerned?
So we continue to invest or investigate different motion being a very big aspect. So there are things like called omni wheels, where you can actually move in multiple different directions at the same very, very quickly. There's ball balancing robots. Those are things we've looked at and investigated and thought about. Those are all concepts that are hard to bring at a consumer price point to market currently, but there could potentially be breakthroughs that help us bridge that. We haven't looked as much, for example, in bipeds or quadrupeds, because those definitely increase the complexity and sometimes the scariness of that, is given that we build it for kids, is actually something we haven't felt comfortable with. But things where hexabots or kind of spider-like motion is again something we've looked at. But those are all things, given the number of motors they require, they also tend to be a little bit more expensive from a consumer price point. So some things are still beyond what we see feasible for the kind of customer we build for, but still using wheels, but in different forms, is something we continue to look at more aggressively.
Great. Well, we are actually short on time. I wanted to leave it for some questions as well. If we have already a couple of questions. All right.
So a lot of parents lack the awareness about this kind of learning about robotics and coding. So are you doing anything to bring in that awareness? You know, because there is a lot of things that kids need to do, sports, arts, other things, and parents sometimes feel that other things are more important. So what are you doing to bring that awareness?
Yeah.
Can I just repeat? I'll repeat the question for those who couldn't hear it. It's about the responsibility of parents as far as talking to their kids about robots, getting them involved.
I think it is a challenge, for us and for us as a society, and not just us, but there are lots of organizations who are helping at least spread the message. So Code.org being a predominant one, where getting the message to a very wide audience. And the tact they've taken is to bring in not just computer scientists, but also bringing in Chris Bosch and so on to give the message a very different appeal to the audience. Because in the end, irrespective of what your kids are going to grow up to, whether a sportsman or an architect or a doctor, it is very likely they will need to understand how the world of technology works in order for them to be good at what they do. So, and that's an important message we need to understand as parents. So we do the best we can, and our focus is largely getting that message to parents, often through teachers, and sometimes to parents directly as well. And slowly it spreads, and I think parents spread the message to other parents through word of mouth as well.
Probably one more, yeah.
So you're targeting kids in between the age of 6 and 10, and so you're targeting kids in the age between 6 and 10, and assuming your product is very effective, do you feel that the traditional educational institutes are capable to keep them challenged going forward and keep them from getting demotivated?
Well, it's a big question. I think it's broader than just the robots. I think as we've seen access to information evolve in a very big way over the last decade or more, the fact that we have such powerful computation capability in our pockets that is connected, so you have access to the information and people all around the world. Definitely education should and must evolve, and what is important must change. At the same time, the roles of adults around kids is very important. I don't think learning can purely happen by sitting in front of a screen for a child, especially in growing up, in 6 or 10-year-old age range. So the role of a teacher is very important. The role of a parent is very important. So we focus on how do we give tools to the teachers as well to be more effective in engaging their children, because engagement is a very core aspect of it. And then bringing that learning so that teachers see themselves as the catalyst for taking that learning to the next stage in the 21st century. So teachers have to evolve, but teachers have to be the catalyst of change as well. So for us, the focus in the classroom is making the teacher successful as much as making kids successful. And surely over time, education system is going to evolve and change, and hopefully that's happening.
Great, I think we're gonna have to cut it off there, but thank you very much for taking the time. We appreciate it. It's a fascinating topic. And are you gonna be around for people to maybe approach you with extra questions?
I'll be on for the next 5-10 minutes maybe, yeah.
Okay, there we are. All right, thank you everybody, appreciate it.